Guys, so next part in a video series talking about katanas. A lot of people who are into Japanese swords are into only Japanese swords and don't necessarily know much about other types of swords. And for me, I've always been more into European swordsmanship, and probably second after European stuff I actually like sort of Indian stuff and Middle Eastern stuff, sort of Indo-Persian. So actually Japanese weapons aren't a big interest of mine, but obviously there's a lot of information out there about Japanese swords. And something that I find curious, because people who tend to be into Japanese weapons and Japanese martial arts don't necessarily know a lot about other martial arts or other types of weapons, I think it's useful to compare, to put the katana in context and compare it to other swords. And there's some common, I think, misconceptions about katanas. At the beginning, what I want to say is that essentially, from a Western point of view, from a European point of view, a katana is really, it's a two-handed sabre. Okay, there's nothing particularly special about it at all as a weapon. If we look at it objectively, it is simply a relatively short sabre blade with a fairly long two-handed grip on it and a very, very basic and minimal disc guard. Its construction and its finish quality is really what gives the katana its fame and its reputation. But in actual fact, at the end of the day, once you've gone through this lengthy process of making a Japanese sword in feudal Japan, what you end up with is a sharpened bit of steel with a handle on the end, much like any other sword. And one thing that I think a lot of katana aficionados and in some cases fanatics aren't necessarily aware of is that this sword's kind of weird proportions, speaking globally. It's got quite a short blade and quite a long handle. Well, we know the long handle is there because it's used with a two-handed grip. That makes perfect sense. But why is the blade so short? Well, not all of them are that short. There are nodashi and tashi, which have earlier period, generally, Japanese swords, which have longer blades on them. But the typical katana that most people are familiar with only usually has about a 27-28 inch blade, and in actual fact most of the replicas are actually longer than most of the antiques. So most of the replicas, which are made primarily, I guess, for the Western market, tend to have about 30-inch blades. Well, actually most of the antique katanas only have about a 27-inch blade, really quite short swords. And just to put that in context, within a European world, that is the same length as a cutlass, as a naval boarding cutlass. There we go, bam! That has this has a 28-inch blade and this has a 28-inch blade. It is a short, the katana is a short sword with a long handle, somewhat similar to the Burmese da and certain types of Chinese sword. But it's quite diminutive in fact. But one of the things that's interesting is that although it's a relatively small weapon, quite a short weapon, it's actually quite heavy for its size. So they tend to weigh about 2.5 to 3 pounds, which for a weapon of that size is a fair weight. It's not heavy, but it's not light either. And actually it compares quite equally with a medieval one-handed sword. So this is the Albion Poitiers. And again, we look at the blade length, and actually this is fairly small sword, the little European one-handed medieval sword actually has a marginally longer blade than the katana. And you know, as we know, the European longsword generally has a substantially longer blade than the katana, even though the hilt is the same length. And this goes back partly to the previous video where we were talking about the way that the blade is made. And so, you know, in Japan, high carbon steel was a very valuable commodity and quite hard to come by. And so really only the edge of this weapon is hard steel, high carbon steel. The rest of the blade is made of lower carbon steel. And because of that construction method, you can't make this long, springy, leaf-like blade that you have with a European sword that does this very easily and is relatively thin. If you made a Japanese style blade that thin, it would be incredibly fragile. So to a certain extent, the fact that the Japanese sword is very thick in this plane, very thick back, is actually a compromise because of the fact that they've had to make the blade this way because they had certain materials available to them to make the sword out of. Other things to consider about it as well. It's a very blade heavy weapon. It's actually not very well balanced. In actual fact, that doesn't matter very much when you're using a weapon two-handed, because you've got both hands on the weapon and you're really using the push and pull leverage to operate the weapon. And also the drawing cut means a lot of the time you're not just doing a swinging blow, but you're pulling with it as well to slice across the target, more so than you would normally do with a European weapon. So the fact that it's very blade heavy is used in the style of swordsmanship that they use with a katana, but they are very blade heavy weapons. They're not as balanced. They're not balanced as near to the hand as European swords tend to be. And to a European swordsman, it actually feels quite clumsy in one hand. It feels a bit like a baseball bat, to be honest. The European swords have a pommel at the back end, and the point of balance is much closer to the hand, and they're just a little bit more lively in the hand. I do know that some katanas have more distal taper in the blade, distal taper being getting flatter this way, getting flatter towards the point. But generally speaking, compared to European swords, they stay very, very thick all the way up. So there we go, I suppose. Putting them into context, katanas are quite short, quite blade heavy, and they're made beautifully, but actually in the hand they feel quite clumsy compared to a lot of Indian, European and Middle Eastern swords. And there's nothing magical about them, they are just a two-handed short sabre at the end of the day. Okay, thank you.